Have you ever been in a restaurant with your friends and they ordered something and you didn't want to order that thing, but still you decided to order that thing? What happened there? Why did you conform? And besides, why do humans start friendships? Why are physically attractive people likelier to get more success? Why do people form tribes and love to be parts of groups? Why do sports team fans get fanatic about their own team but can get very hostile to other teams? All of those things are studied in social psychology. In this video, I'm going to share with you 6 key studies that shaped the direction of social psychology. Now, of course, this is not going to be exhaustive, but it's meant to be a taster. So let's dive right into it. So study number 1 is this study by Sherif, who studies the effects of conformity. Now, what does conformity mean? It just means that when there is a group, the opinion of the group sort of tends to converge. It tends to become one opinion after a while. And he studied this, one of the first studies, in this very elegant paradigm. What he had is a dark room with a glowing light at the end of the room. Now, if you know about anything about lights in a dark room, it appears that it's sort of moving, especially if it's a bit far away. So think about like traffic lights, like bright traffic lights when you're at the traffic light, but not very close to it, but sort of very far to it. And now imagine everything else were to be dark. It would appear as if it is moving. Now, Sherif did this very interesting thing where he had people individually observe these lights, and he asked them, hey, how much is this light moved? How much has this light moved in the last whatever? I don't know what his exact time period was, but let's say 1 minute for the sake of argument. And each of them had their opinions and they gave Sherif their answers. And then he got many people in with a group. So before they were individual, and now they were in the part of a group. Now they were part of a group. Guess what happened? The individuals had their own subjective opinion about how much the light moved, but as time passed on and when they were in a group, their opinions, their estimate of how much the light was moving tended to converge, and it became one single estimate. So here is a graph that comes from the study. So you can see that people have different opinions in the beginning, and as time moves on and as they are, more importantly, part of a group, their opinions tend to converge. We like to think that we are all individuals and we will maintain our realities and our own opinions, but a study like this shows us that once we are part of a group, our opinions tend to converge. Now, one criticism that has been given about the previous study is that the light itself was not moving. So it was sort of what's called an ambiguous stimuli. There was no like objective right answer in terms of how much the light moved. In fact, the objective right answer would have been probably it did not move. And so, it was sort of unclear what the stimulus was. What if we made it more precise? What if you were close to the traffic light? Now would people have their own individual opinions and not conform as much? So this sort of criticism led to this new study by Asch, again a very popular study, in which the experimenter sat people around a table and asked them to compare lengths of lines. You'll see a graphic there, and they asked them which line matches this line right here. So they gave 3 options for that, and you can probably tell that this line right here matches this line right here. And now what they did is asked people the same question, except the key difference was the people were seated in a round table, and before the real participants said their answers, there were 5 or 6 people previously that went before them, and they all gave the wrong answer. And then Asch measured how many times did they conform. What they found was still a significant chunk of people that gave the wrong answer. They chose the wrong line by the pressure of the group. Now, in this study, it is important to note that the majority of people, about 64% of people, did give the right answer, but a sizable minority, like 30-something 98% of people gave the wrong answer, despite it being relatively crystal clear about what the lengths of the lines were and which lines were similar. So this experiment also highlights our tendencies to conform to a group, despite the fact that the stimulus in this case was relatively crystal clear. So the next study is by Cialdini and colleagues. This person also wrote the famous pop psychological book, Influence. Now in this study, Cialdini and colleagues put some piece of paper in people's cars, so right by their windshield, and what they were interested in measuring is whether people threw this piece of paper outside, so whether or not they littered. Except they obviously manipulated something, just like experimenters do, some evil manipulation. And in this case, the manipulation was either their surrounding was clean or their surrounding was not clean. And another manipulation, it was like a 2x2 design that scientists call it, was a confederate, which is a planted person by the experimenter. This confederate either walks by without littering or they litter. So imagine if you were in their study, you would find that, hey, there is a piece of paper in the middle of my car windshield and I need to trash it. What you will see around you is either a clean environment or not a clean environment, and then you will see a person litter or not litter in those environments. What they found is that people littered much more when they were in a littered environment as compared to a clean environment. And they littered especially more when the confederate also littered in the littered environment. Now this suggests that we are more likely to sort of commit crime, and this is often framed as the broken windows theory, which is if you notice signs of crime or signs of things not being orderly in any environment, then we are more likely to comply by that crime. We are more likely to act not in our best selves. So the environment matters a lot. As a side note, I am also studying for the effects of the environment, but not in a littering context. I'm studying how does the effect of environment differ for starting friendships. So how does your tendency to start friendships change depending on whether you meet someone, let's say in a bar or a club, versus if you met them in a classroom or a workplace. They're still the same people, but the relationship that they will form will be different. And how does that relate to people's self-esteem and other mental health variables is one of the things that I study in my own research. Now you may have heard of the next study. This is the famous Stanley Milgram experiment. I'm just going to quickly recap. Stanley Milgram was this American psychologist who decided to study the effects of obedience, so the effects of authority on people's behavior. So imagine if you were a participant in Stanley's study, what you would do is, first of all, you didn't know what was going on. You would be recruited for a task on learning, as this recruitment letter suggests. And once you are inside the experiment, you would be assigned the role of the teacher, and someone else who is planted by the experimenter would be assigned the role of the learner. And then what would happen is you would have to administer a test to the learner, and if they gave the correct answer, all good. But if they did not give the correct answer, then you had to give them a small electric shock. Now I know that's a bit goofy, and these kinds of experiments are no longer done, but at that time it was allowed, so hey, that happened. And just to make sure that the shocks were real, the experimenters gave the teacher a small electric shock as well, just to make them believe that there were actual shocks administered. Now here's the catch. I said small electric shocks, but that's not exactly true. The more the learner failed, the teacher was asked to escalate the levels of shock they gave, and the shocks went right up to lethal levels of 450 volts. So people would die with those shocks. Now, of course, in reality, there were no real shocks administered, and the learner was not a learner, but just a computer tape. So one of Stanley's prediction here was that people would actually disconform, people would actually be disobedient and tell the experimenter to stop. But sadly, that was not found out to be true. What happened in reality, the dotted line is the experimenter's prediction, which is The more the shocks grew, the more people would back out from the experiment. But sadly, the more solid black line is what happened. And a fair majority of people, more than 65 or something percent of people, actually administered lethal electric shocks to the learner. They were madly in distress, as seen by many of the clips of the experiment. But it taught us a very important lesson, which is once you wear a lab coat, once there's some authority in the picture, people's behavior can drastically change, even if it means killing someone. As a side note, Darren Brown, the magician, also has a special on Netflix called The Push, where he executes the same experiment. Have a look. The next study is our abilities to form a tribe and our helping behavior within our tribes. So we like to think that we help everyone, and no matter who's in need, we'd help them. But this study does question that a little, at least. And it adds in at least a variable. In this study, they asked football fans, more specifically Liverpool football fans, to write about their club. They asked them to write about their affiliations to the club, how much they like Liverpool, and so on and so forth. And once they had things written down, the experimenters asked them from building A to building B, and in their walk from building A to building B, someone would trip and fall. And this was obviously planted by the experimenter. Again, cheeky experimenters. And the participants, what the experiments were sort of seeing is, would these participants help this person who tripped or not? Now here's the catch. The person who would trip would either be wearing a Liverpool jersey or they would be wearing a Manchester United jersey, which, if you don't know much about football, they look quite similar. They're red, and they're football jerseys, but of a rival team or of a opposing camp. And then what would happen with that? And just as a control group, they also had a third group of people who were just red t-shirts, so nothing fancy. They're still red, and they are still kind of look similar to the others, but they are neither Liverpool nor Manchester United nor belonging to any other team. So I would ask you at this point, what would you think happened? Take a moment to guess. Well, here are the results. People in fact helped the Liverpool jersey person who tripped more than they helped the Manchester United person, and more than they helped the control group. Can this effect be changed? In another follow-up study, these experimenters asked people to write about football in general and not about any specific club. So they primed them about their affiliations to football. And then they repeated the same experiment, except this time they found that people helped both the Liverpool and Manchester United people who tripped than they helped a control group. So the tribe we identify with is the tribe we are likely to help. At least this is what this study suggests. And so for the final experiment, we are going to talk about, again, another very famous study called the Robber's Cave experiment. Now, in this experiment, young high school boys were recruited. I think they were like 11 or 12 years old. And they were all sort of similar. They all were white and came from similar backgrounds. And what the researchers wanted to test is, can you now form groups within these two people? And would these groups be hostile to each other at some point in the experiment? Now again, a research study like this is very unlikely to happen in today's day and age, because we have much more severe regulations around ethics and the students and the participants' welfare. So if you have a very dire picture of social psychology in mind by now, that's not the case. What happens in nowadays, it's much more regulated, and there's a much strict procedure around ethical approval whenever you want to do a study. Anyway, coming back to Robber's Cave study, they formed two groups between these two people, and the way they strengthened their group identity is made these two groups by themselves do certain activities together. So this was like a camping site that they got these students at. So things like make food or carry this thing from one place to the other, and they gave these tasks to these young kids, and the intention was that they would now form these bonds, and that is true. That is in fact what happened, and that was like the first part of the study. All of this while, by the way, there were researchers acting as scouts who kept an eye on the kids. Now in the second phase of the experiment was the competitive phase. That's when they made kids clash against each other. So there was actually a physical wall, a makeshift wall that was separating one group from the other, and they broke that wall. So now there were kids who could interact with each other, except they gave them competitive tasks to do. Now this went absolutely wild, to the point that the researchers had to intervene multiple times to prevent a literal fist fight. But even without that, there were instances of the kids burning the other tribe's flag. And I think there were instances of like throwing stones at some of their places. And as I said, there were chances of an actual fist fight happening, and the researchers had to even intervene at some point in the experiment. And in the final part, in stage 3 of the experiment, they gave these kids collaborative tasks. So they asked them to work towards a shared common goal. So now they are no longer competing against each other, but they're instead doing things that are towards a common mission, towards a common goal. And what they found was, by the end of the experiment, the kids actually became pretty friendly. In fact, this is a photo of them all leaving the campsite together inside the same bus. So no more rivalry, no more fist fights, and no more animosity. So this experiment suggests again this power of the identification group, and perhaps more importantly, what are you working towards together? Like, are you working towards a shared mission, or are you working against each other? And I'm sure you have observed in your own life where you have a spouse, or you have a partner, or you have your best friend, or you have friends in general. And when you do things together, when you sort of grow together and share experiences together, you probably experience a deeper bond and a deeper connection. Well, alright, this was the video on social psychology. I hope you learned something. I would again repeat, a lot of these experiments are considered unethical by today's standards, and these experiments did raise massive ethical concerns even back in the day. So I don't want you to think that social psychology is evil, but this was just like some classic studies that have shaped and informed our understanding of the field to follow. Alright, so if you like this video, please give it a thumbs up, share it around. I have a free podcast on emotional intelligence. Feel free to check it out. It's not exactly research psychology. I'm not gonna bombard you with studies. It's much more me speaking from the heart on how we can live better and healthier emotional lives. There's actually a scorecard which I'll link to in the description, which you can take, and it will give you a sense of the areas in which you are good in emotional intelligence and the areas that may need improvement. But regardless, check out the podcast. It's for free, and even if you don't, just thank you very much for listening, and see you in the next video. Peace.